Welcome the anointed ones. Be careful what you whisper in the dark, because walls are snitches with long memories. Family, tonight's story isn't just drama, it's revelation. Imagine this. A group of people so confident in their wickedness, they actually thought a locked room and hushed tones would protect them. They sat around a table plotting your downfall, laughing at the idea of you ever standing tall again. But here's the twist. Someone overheard every word. Not some random gossip, not an accidental slip, but a clear, undeniable report that landed straight into the hands of the police. And let's not pretend history hasn't taught us this lesson. According to studies on human behavior, over 80% of criminal conspiracies collapse, not because of complex investigations, but because somebody overheard a conversation they weren't supposed to. In other words, evil doesn't die because it's outsmarted. It dies because it can't stop talking. That's exactly what happened here. They thought they were masterminds when really they were just loud villains in a bad movie, forgetting the microphones are always on. And just like that, the very words they used to chain you became the receipts that bound them. Stick with me, because this isn't just about exposure, it's about the divine comedy of justice. The same mouths that tried to bury you are the same mouths that dug their own graves, and trust me, you'll want to hear how this secret meeting turned from strategy session into confession booth. Number 1, they thought whispers could hide in darkness, but darkness has ears. They thought whispers could hide in darkness, but darkness has ears. That is the flaw of every secret gathering. They forget that silence is never truly silent, and privacy is never absolute. What they said in confidence was not swallowed up by the night. It was carried by it, like smoke that eventually escapes the cracks. Every word, every detail, every lie they thought was hidden was absorbed into the atmosphere and returned to the world as undeniable evidence. The irony is that these individuals believed secrecy gave them power. They assumed that because doors were closed and voices were lowered, their guilt would stay invisible. But here's the truth. Secrecy does not erase accountability, it only postpones it. Darkness has a way of storing things, and when the time comes, it releases them with a vengeance. They didn't just hold a meeting, they performed a confession without realizing it. Their mistake was in thinking they could control the narrative forever. The universe has a strange justice system, one that doesn't always need courts or lawyers to function. Sometimes all it takes is one unplanned ear, one stranger in the right place, or one divine arrangement for the truth to leak out. And when it does, it spreads faster than they ever prepared for. Their whispers turned into echoes, and those echoes turned into reports. That's when fear sets in, not because you confronted them, but because they realized the walls they trusted betrayed them. When people gather in secret to conspire, they rarely ask themselves who else might be listening. They forget that sound does not vanish, it travels. They forget that the same darkness they hide in belongs to a creator who sees everything. And so what they believed was their safe space became the very setting of their undoing. The silence they trusted became the witness that carried their guilt to others. There's a lesson buried in this. Evil always overestimates its ability to remain hidden. It assumes invisibility equals invincibility. But the truth is, every plot, no matter how carefully crafted, creates its own trail of exposure. Their whispers did not protect them, they betrayed them. Darkness kept the receipt, and when the time was right, it handed them over. Number 2, the trap they built became their own confession booth. The trap they built became their own confession booth. That's the cruel twist of hidden schemes. What starts as strategy ends up being evidence. In that secret meeting, they thought they were piecing together a clever plan against you. But every detail they discussed was a record of their crimes. They wanted to bury you under lies, but instead they were burying themselves under proof. The more they talked, the deeper they dug their own hole. It's one thing to plot in silence, but they weren't silent at all. They laughed, they exchanged details, they spoke with the arrogance of people who thought no one could ever hold them accountable. That arrogance blinded them to the reality that their words had weight, and once spoken, those words could not be taken back. They became confessions disguised as strategy. Every accusation they rehearsed, every manipulation they planned, every dirty trick they thought they were polishing was really them narrating the case against themselves. That's how exposure works. It doesn't always come from investigators with magnifying glasses or long interrogations. Sometimes it comes from people too confident in their own safety, forgetting that a single slip is enough to unravel years of scheming. In that moment, their meeting transformed. It stopped being about you and became about them. Their intent was laid bare, their tactics revealed, their unity fractured because each person's involvement was spelled out in undeniable terms. They were not just conspirators, they were witnesses against themselves. The beauty of this downfall is in its irony. They designed the room as a trap for you, a place where they could rehearse how to corner you. But the very act of speaking their plans out loud turned that room into their courtroom. They testified against themselves without realizing it. They offered details the police could never have dreamed of discovering on their own. In trying to weaponize their words, they made their words into weapons against themselves. That's the law of hidden evil. It doesn't just collapse, it self-destructs. They didn't need anyone to twist their stories because their stories twisted themselves. What was meant to chain you down became the rope they tied around their own necks. The trap they built for you became the evidence that convicted them. Number 3, they never considered that silence has witnesses. They never considered that silence has witnesses. That is the arrogance of people who live by secrets. They think that if no human eye sees and no human mouth speaks, then their wrongs are erased. But silence doesn't erase, it records. The air remembers vibrations, the walls hold on to sound, and the atmosphere itself becomes a witness. What they whispered into what they thought was a void didn't vanish. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to be carried to the ears that would bring everything to light. The greatest miscalculation of these people is believing that silence is neutral. It never is. Silence is alive. It absorbs what's spoken in its presence and delivers it at the time when exposure is due. That is why the truth finds its way out no matter how carefully someone tries to suppress it. They assumed silence was on their side, but it was never loyal to them. It was only patient. Every word they spoke in that meeting had weight. They thought they could speak freely because no one was visibly listening. But just because a room looks empty doesn't mean it is void of testimony. Every sound they made left a trace, and those traces aligned themselves against them. They didn't need someone to shout about what they had done. The silence they trusted did the shouting for them. That is why their crimes didn't stay hidden. There's also a deeper layer to this. Silence has a way of partnering with justice. It waits until the guilty are confident, until they believe no trace exists, and then it speaks at the worst possible time for them, the moment when exposure cuts the deepest. That's what happened here. Their meeting wasn't just overheard by chance. It was silence cashing in the debt it had collected from their whispers. And when silence finally broke, it broke loud enough that the police themselves could not ignore it. They believed silence would protect them, but silence was only building a case. They believed silence meant safety, but silence was actually the witness preparing to testify. What they failed to understand is that even when no one else is in the room, there is no such thing as secrecy. Silence doesn't keep secrets, it keeps receipts. And when the time comes, those receipts are handed over in full. Number 4, their private meeting was a public trial in disguise. Their private meeting was a public trial in disguise. They assumed closed doors meant safety, that secrecy could shield them from exposure. But what they didn't realize is that the moment they sat together to conspire, they placed themselves on trial without knowing it. Every word spoken was evidence, every agreement was testimony, and every detail became a record of guilt. They thought they were strategizing in confidence, but they were actually presenting their case to an invisible jury that sees beyond locks and walls. The problem with evil is that it never accounts for the unseen. They believed their power rested in their ability to hide, but the truth is, nothing hidden stays hidden forever. There are forces greater than human systems that record what takes place in secret. The room they trusted was not their shelter. It was their courtroom. The moment they spoke, their intent was registered, and their words became a declaration of guilt. They didn't just meet to talk about you. They met to sign their own judgment. What makes this so devastating for them is how ordinary it must have felt at first. They likely felt comfortable, even bold, speaking freely as though their plots were protected by silence. But that false sense of security turned against them. The very confidence that made them speak openly was the confidence that condemned them. They assumed their whispers dissolved into thin air, but thin air doesn't forget. It holds on to words and waits for the day those words are brought back as evidence. And that's exactly what happened. That meeting didn't end when the doors opened. It followed them. Their so-called private discussion became an open record. A messenger carried their crimes out into the light. And suddenly what they thought was safe became their downfall. It wasn't just exposure, it was judgment. The room where they conspired became the courtroom where they were tried, and their own voices became the witnesses against them. This is why secrecy is always a trap for the corrupt. Every private plot is really a public trial waiting to happen. They were not safe in that meeting. They were already standing in front of a judge they couldn't see, and the verdict was already being written against them. Number 5. They underestimated the power of the uninvited listener. They underestimated the power of the uninvited listener. For all their planning, their whispers, their supposed airtight secrecy, it only took one unexpected ear to unravel everything. That's the fragility of corruption. It doesn't need an army to expose it, just one person who wasn't supposed to be there. A single outsider present at the right moment turned their fortress of secrecy into a house of cards. Years of manipulation, cover-ups, and carefully constructed lies came crashing down because someone happened to hear the truth raw and unfiltered. This is the kind of downfall that terrifies those who thrive in deception. They spend years trying to control every angle, every narrative, every possible leak. They manipulate systems, silence voices, and pressure anyone who dares to question them. Yet the one thing they can never control is who happens to be listening when they let their guard down. One person, invisible in their eyes, became the turning point of their entire story. That person didn't need power, money, or influence. They only needed ears. What makes this exposure even more devastating is the way it destroys their illusion of control. For so long they convinced themselves they were untouchable, that their secrets were safe because the circle was tight. But power doesn't collapse from the outside. It usually falls from one crack inside the wall. That crack was the listener they didn't invite, the observer they didn't notice, the presence they dismissed. By underestimating that ear, they underestimated the entire force of truth itself. And the irony, they thought they were the hunters, circling and cornering you in secrecy. Instead, they were the prey, hunted by their own arrogance. They didn't realize that one ear could become many, and one report could multiply into official records and investigations. All it took was one witness to transfer their hidden crimes into the light of law and justice. That's the fatal flaw of those who conspire. They mistake invisibility for invincibility. They believe if they cannot be seen, they cannot be touched. But a single listener proved otherwise. One uninvited presence dismantled their empire of whispers, leaving them exposed, fragile, and powerless against the very truth they thought they had buried forever. Number 6. Evil's confidence is always its downfall. Evil's confidence is always its downfall. The people who gathered in that secret meeting thought they were safe, untouchable, beyond consequence. Their arrogance tricked them into believing no one could hear, no one could stop them, and no one would ever challenge their version of reality. That false confidence loosened their tongues and opened their mouths wider than they ever should have. They didn't realize that the very freedom with which they spoke was the noose tightening around their own necks. That's the irony of corruption. It doesn't get exposed by silence. It gets exposed by overconfidence. They believed secrecy gave them immunity, but secrecy without humility is just arrogance wearing a mask. Instead of whispering carefully, they spoke too freely. Instead of hiding their intentions, they mocked and bragged about them. And in that reckless freedom, they left behind evidence that couldn't be erased. Words once spoken can't be undone, and their pride blinded them to that reality. Arrogance is the great deceiver. It convinces people that rules don't apply to them, that consequences are for others, and that their schemes are too clever to ever collapse. But history, both personal and global, proves over and over that arrogance is not protection, it's exposure waiting to happen. They didn't fall because someone cornered them. They fell because they cornered themselves. They didn't collapse because their enemies were stronger. They collapsed because their pride was louder than their caution. What makes this downfall sting even more for them is that it was preventable. They could have stayed quiet. They could have hidden longer. But arrogance always pushes for more. It pushes people to talk when they should stay silent, to boast when they should remain cautious, to laugh when they should tremble. That's exactly what happened. Their pride made them believe they were in control, when in reality, pride had already signed their destruction. And that is the truth about evil. It always carries within it the seed of its own ruin. They thought they were untouchable, but that very thought was their undoing. Confidence without conscience is not strength. It's suicide in slow motion. They didn't lose because someone was smarter than them. They lost because arrogance blinded them to the fact that every careless word was evidence, and evidence always finds its way home. Number 7, their meeting proved they were terrified of your innocence. Their meeting proved they were terrified of your innocence. Think about it. If you were really guilty, if their accusations against you held even a shred of truth, why would they need to gather in the shadows behind closed doors, carefully coordinating their stories? Why would they need to rehearse lies and invent strategies? Genuine guilt doesn't require rehearsals. It exposes itself naturally. The fact that they had to scheme so hard is the clearest proof that what they feared wasn't your wrongdoing, but your innocence. Innocence is a dangerous weapon to those who thrive on manipulation. It doesn't crumble under interrogation. It doesn't slip under pressure, and it doesn't leave stains they can point to. Innocence forces liars to overwork themselves, to bend rules, to twist narratives, to silence truths. And that is exactly what their meeting revealed. They weren't confident in the evidence they had against you because there was none. Their only option was to create illusions, and illusions require constant maintenance. The fact that they needed secrecy exposes just how weak their case truly was. If the truth had been on their side, they would have had no reason to whisper. They would have stood boldly, openly, with facts that could not be shaken. But the moment you see people ducking into corners, controlling narratives, and plotting in whispers, it becomes obvious. They are not defending truth. They are defending lies. And lies cannot survive sunlight. What makes this even more powerful is that your innocence didn't just frustrate them. It terrified them. Innocence dismantles lies without effort. It makes conspirators panic because it doesn't need a defense team. It is its own defense. That's why they had to coordinate. They weren't confident you'd collapse under pressure, so they tried to build a pressure strong enough to bury you. But even then, the weight of their schemes couldn't overpower the strength of a clean record. Their meeting, in truth, was not about you being dangerous because of guilt. It was about you being unstoppable because of innocence. They needed to manipulate systems, twist laws, and rehearse lies just to create the illusion of credibility. That's why the exposure of their meeting is so devastating. It didn't just uncover their crimes, it revealed their deepest fear. And that fear was never your failure, it was always your innocence. Number 8, they turned conspiracy into criminal records. They turned conspiracy into criminal records. What they thought was just a private exchange of strategies became a paper trail without paper, a living record of their own corruption. Every plot they laid out, every lie they rehearsed, every scheme they tried to polish wasn't just talk. It was evidence. Words are not weightless, they carry force, and once spoken, they cannot be unsaid. In that secret room, they weren't just conspiring, they were dictating the transcripts of their own indictment. This is the part that exposes their foolishness. For so long they believed they were erasing your credibility, but in truth, they were scripting their own downfall. They thought they were in control of the narrative, when really the narrative was recording them. Instead of burying you, they were leaving receipts of their own guilt. And when those words leaked out, they transformed from whispers into legally recognizable proof. Their conspiracy mutated into documentation strong enough to stand in a courtroom. That's how arrogance works. It blinds people into thinking their words are safe just because no pen is moving and no recorder is in sight. But time and again, history shows that spoken conspiracies are just as dangerous as written ones because sound carries memory. Somebody always hears. Somebody always remembers. And eventually those words get repeated, retold, and solidified into statements that no one can deny. They believed they were too clever to leave a trace, but their mouths betrayed them. This is the irony. They worked so hard to paint you guilty, but all their energy only proved themselves guilty. Every detail they shared became self-incrimination. Every plan became an entry in the record. Every laugh at your expense became another nail in their coffin. They didn't just speak carelessly, they spoke recklessly, not realizing that their so-called private meeting would end up being more damning than any external investigation. What they underestimated is that truth doesn't always need a detective. It often waits for arrogance to speak too much. That's exactly what happened. Their conspiracy collapsed not because someone forced it open, but because they couldn't resist talking. And in the end, those careless words didn't just expose them, they convicted them. Their attempt to destroy you was nothing more than their own voices documenting their crimes. Number 9. Secrecy is never protection, only delay. Secrecy is never protection, only delay. They walked into that room convinced that shutting doors meant shutting out accountability. To them, secrecy was a shield, something that could cover their lies and keep their crimes insulated. But what they didn't understand is that secrecy doesn't protect. It only stretches time. It creates an illusion of safety, not the reality of it. All it really does is delay the inevitable moment when truth breaks through. And their meeting proved this with brutal clarity. Every whisper behind those walls carried an expiration date. Lies are fragile, no matter how well hidden. They rot from the inside until they collapse under their own weight. These people believed they had mastered the art of hiding, coordinating in secret, keeping outsiders at bay, protecting one another's reputations. But closed doors do not erase the truth. They only postpone its arrival. And when truth finally knocks, it doesn't come politely. It bursts through with a force that secrecy cannot withstand. Their gathering showed the limits of their control. They thought secrecy guaranteed survival, but survival built on lies is a ticking clock. It was only a matter of time before something slipped, before someone overheard, before a detail leaked. The beauty of truth is that it doesn't need an invitation. It finds its way through cracks, through whispers, through unplanned witnesses. That's why their meeting, so carefully hidden, ended up being the very thing that betrayed them. What makes this even more striking is how their secrecy exposed their fear. If they were truly confident, they wouldn't need to hide. The very act of gathering in private showed that deep down they knew they were guilty, and they knew they were vulnerable. They weren't protecting themselves from lies, they were protecting themselves from truth. And no matter how long they tried to delay it, truth was always going to catch up. That's the nature of exposure. It doesn't care how many doors you close or how many secrets you keep. Secrecy doesn't change the outcome, it only changes the timing. And when the timing finally arrived, their illusion shattered. Their closed doors bought them time, but they could not buy them freedom. Delay is not escape, and their meeting proved it. Number 10, the police didn't just hear crimes, they heard intent. The police didn't just hear crimes, they heard intent. There's a difference between stumbling into wrongdoing and deliberately, gleefully plotting it. When someone commits a crime, there can be room for excuses, desperation, impulse, or circumstance. But when people gather together to plan, to mock, to strategize in detail, it strips away all excuses. It shows the heart behind the act. It proves there was no accident, no moment of weakness, just calculated evil dressed up as confidence. That's what made their secret meeting so damning. It wasn't just the crimes themselves that came to light, but the spirit in which those crimes were conceived, the laughter, the arrogance, the casual way they spoke about destroying you revealed something much deeper than action. It revealed character. And once intent is exposed, there's no defense left. Because while actions can sometimes be twisted or explained away, intent is pure and undeniable. The legal system itself is built on this reality. Courts don't just ask what happened, they ask why it happened. Intent turns a careless act into a crime, and it turns suspicion into certainty. That's why their meeting became a disaster for them. Every detail they rehearsed and every joke they cracked while discussing it painted a picture of people who weren't forced into wrongdoing but who delighted in it. And that's the kind of evidence that sticks, not just in a courtroom, but in the conscience of everyone who hears it. The exposure of their intent is also what makes their downfall poetic, because it shows that their evil wasn't just about harming you. It was about mocking innocence, about feeling untouchable, about believing they could manipulate reality itself. But arrogance leaves footprints, and intent leaves fingerprints that can't be scrubbed away. They didn't just reveal what they planned, they revealed who they really were when no one was supposed to be watching. And here lies the most powerful part. Actions can sometimes be forgiven, but intent leaves a stain on the soul. When the police received that report, they weren't just confronted with evidence of crimes, they were confronted with proof of deliberate wickedness. That is something far harder to explain away. In the end, their intent shouted louder than any defense they could invent. It wasn't only their actions that condemned them, it was the darkness of their intent that sealed their fate. Number 11. They didn't know the system they manipulated would turn on them. They didn't know the system they manipulated would turn on them. For years they thrived on bending rules, pulling strings, and hiding behind connections. They assumed institutions were their playgrounds, their safety nets, their shields from consequence. They thought they had bribed enough, threatened enough, or twisted enough procedures to guarantee immunity. But here's the reality they never considered. When truth enters the room, even corrupted systems are forced to shift. Truth doesn't need permission, it bypasses the very walls built to contain it. That's what makes their exposure so devastating. The system they thought belonged to them suddenly turned into their judge. The police, whom they may have seen as tools or pawns, were confronted with evidence too raw to ignore. The weight of what was overheard wasn't just gossip, it was undeniable proof. And proof forces even compromised institutions to act, because once truth is out, it's bigger than personal loyalty or hidden favors. The system they leaned on to silence others became the platform that announced their downfall. This reversal is poetic justice. They believed power was permanent because they had learned how to manipulate it. But manipulation only lasts until something greater breaks through, and truth is greater. Truth doesn't play favorites. Truth doesn't bend to threats. Truth, once revealed, makes even the most compromised structures tremble, because to ignore it is to collapse under its weight. That's why the very system they corrupted could no longer protect them. It would have destroyed itself trying to do so. What they didn't see coming was that the same institutions they used as weapons against you could transform into weapons against them. They were too arrogant to believe the rules could ever apply in reverse, yet the moment their crimes were documented, the system had no choice but to do its job. Their illusion of control shattered. What they once manipulated now demanded their accountability. That's the irony of corruption. It always eats its own. They thought the system would forever be theirs to command, but the system turned into the very stage where their guilt was displayed. They forgot that no matter how much you bend the truth has a way of snapping back. And when it does, it doesn't just expose lies, it flips the entire system against those who once thought they owned it. Number 12. Exposure isn't just legal, it's spiritual. Exposure isn't just legal, it's spiritual. The moment their words slipped into the wrong ears, it stopped being a simple matter of evidence and became something far greater. Yes, what was overheard could be written into police reports, dissected in courtrooms and used to prove crimes beyond denial. But the deeper reality is that this exposure was a form of judgment. It was proof that higher forces had stepped in, that justice had risen above their games and declared, enough. For so long they believed they were getting away with everything. They mistook silence for approval and delay for escape. They thought because they could bend human systems, they could escape all systems. But the moment those whispers leaked out, it became clear they were never as hidden as they believed. The exposure didn't just reveal their crimes to people, it revealed their corruption to the spiritual order that governs all things. It showed that injustice, no matter how carefully hidden, never goes unnoticed. That is the weight of what happened. A secret conversation turned into a public verdict, not just because someone overheard, but because it was time for accountability. There are moments in life when events stop being coincidence and start being orchestration. The timing, the positioning, the way their arrogance collided with truth, all of it reveals a larger hand at work. That's why this moment is more than legal, it's divine intervention. And this is where the impact cuts even deeper. Legal consequences may punish actions, but spiritual exposure punishes the illusion of control. They didn't just lose protection in the eyes of law, they lost the covering they thought shielded them from consequence. It was a stripping away, a pulling back of every false layer they had built. leaving them bare in front of justice that cannot be bribed or silenced. What was overheard was more than incriminating words. It was a revelation that no system of lies lasts forever, and no injustice remains invisible. Higher forces allowed that moment to unfold to prove a point. Corruption may delay justice, but it cannot deny it. Their downfall wasn't only the result of human ears, it was the echo of divine judgment, making sure the truth could no longer be hidden. Number 13. The plot against you became the plot that doomed them. The plot against you became the plot that doomed them. They walked into that meeting with one agenda: how to strip you of credibility, how to tarnish your name, how to make sure you never stood tall again. They believed the walls would protect their schemes and that their whispers would bind you in chains you could never break. But what they didn't realize was that in plotting your downfall, they were writing the script for their own collapse. The same meeting designed to bury you became the seed of their undoing. This is the great irony of evil. It always circles back on itself. Every detail they shared, every lie they rehearsed, every laugh they had at your expense was not fuel for your destruction, but ammunition for theirs. What was meant to weaken you ended up strengthening your position. What was meant to erase you became the undeniable proof that exposed them. They thought they were clever conspirators, but in truth they were architects of their own demise. The beauty of this reversal is how it stripped them of control. For so long they convinced themselves they had the upper hand. They thought you were vulnerable, powerless against their coordinated lies. But when their words leaked, it became clear who had really been vulnerable all along. You didn't need to outmaneuver them. They destroyed themselves by the sheer weight of their own arrogance. They put their credibility on trial, not yours. And the fallout wasn't small. It wasn't just that their plot failed, it reversed. The exposure didn't just neutralize their attack, it flipped the entire narrative. You survived untouched, while their empire of lies collapsed under the evidence they created with their own mouths. They underestimated how fragile deception really is. A single leak was enough to topple what they had built for years, and once it crumbled, there was no rebuilding. That's why this moment is so powerful. Their conspiracy didn't just fail, it backfired. It secured your survival while dismantling everything they thought made them untouchable. Their empire wasn't undone by outsiders, but by the very plans they thought would secure its future. In trying to destroy you, they destroyed themselves. And that is the unbreakable law of corruption. The pit they dug for you became the grave they fell into. Number 14. Their fear wasn't that you'd fight back. It was that truth would speak without you. Their fear wasn't that you'd fight back. It was that truth would speak without you. They weren't losing sleep because of your strength, your resources, or even your ability to defend yourself. What unsettled them was something far more terrifying: the possibility that truth, left unguarded, would surface on its own. Truth doesn't need a lawyer, a stage, or even your presence. It carries its own voice, undeniable and unshakable. That's what they feared most. If they believed you were a real threat on your own, they would have tried to confront you directly. But they didn't. Instead, they scrambled into secrecy, plotting behind closed doors, trying to control every detail of the narrative. Why? Because truth doesn't negotiate. Once it slips out, it spreads without permission. They knew that if even one sliver of the truth about their crimes escaped, it would speak louder than any of their carefully rehearsed lies. That's the nightmare they couldn't escape. This is what makes their desperation so clear. They didn't just want to silence you. They wanted to silence the possibility of truth itself. They feared that even if you said nothing, the facts would still find a way to surface, carried by witnesses, circumstances, or sheer divine timing. And they were right. Because the truth didn't need your defense, it defended itself. It showed up in overheard words, in careless laughter, in moments they thought were invisible but were actually being recorded by forces far greater than them. That's the real reason their secret meeting was exposed. It wasn't because you launched some attack or went digging into their schemes. It was because truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. They feared that inevitability, because once truth speaks, it doesn't stutter. It cuts through manipulation, it embarrasses lies, and it dismantles the false empires people build to look untouchable. And here's the sting for them. Their entire empire of deceit was built on the assumption that you'd fight back and fail. But you didn't need to fight. Truth itself became your defense, and that is the one enemy they can't defeat. They can manipulate people, bend systems, and distort perception, but they cannot silence truth. Their fear was never really you. Their fear was that truth would speak without you, and when it did, it spoke louder than they ever could. In the end, their carefully constructed world of lies, manipulation, and secrecy crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. Every plot they crafted, every whisper meant to destroy you, every strategy designed to erase your credibility became evidence of their guilt. What they thought was safety behind closed doors became their courtroom, their trap, their undoing. Their arrogance, their overconfidence, their underestimation of truth, and the single ears that overheard their schemes all combined to turn their conspiracy into their own downfall. They weren't just exposed, they were revealed, not only legally but spiritually, morally, and undeniably. Their fear, their panic, and their collapse didn't come because of what you did, but because truth itself demanded justice. The very forces they tried to manipulate, the systems they thought were pliable, and the walls they trusted all turned against them. Every word they spoke became a witness, every secret meeting a public trial, and every plan to destroy you a blueprint for their own destruction. You didn't have to fight, you didn't even have to defend yourself. Your innocence, the unstoppable voice of truth, and the inevitability of justice carried you through. While they scrambled in the shadows, you stood tall in the light of exposure, untouchable because what is pure cannot be tarnished by deceit. Their empire of manipulation collapsed, and their arrogance left them powerless before a world that finally saw the truth. This isn't just a story of exposure, it's a testament to the unstoppable nature of truth, the inevitability of justice, and the power of innocence over conspiracy. What they tried to bury became the very force that unearthed them. Their whispers of destruction became the echoes that condemned them. And in the end, while they fell, you emerged not just unscathed, but victorious, proof that no scheme against truth can ever succeed. Stand in that victory, because their collapse isn't just their punishment, it's your undeniable testament. If you found this revelation powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share this story so others can see the unstoppable power of truth in action. If this story opened your eyes and shook you to the core, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that uncovers the truth others try to hide. Smash that like to show your support and let the world know you stand with justice. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts, experiences, or reactions. Your voice matters and could spark the next revelation. And most importantly, share this video with everyone who needs to see how truth always rises, no matter the lies stacked against it. Don't just watch, be part of the movement. God bless you.